Okay, good afternoon, everyone. It's just about 12:30. Can I get a thumbs up from the panelists if you can hear me? All right. Good afternoon. I'm Pat Courtney Strong here on behalf of the Capital District Regional Planning Commission and the Central New York Regional Planning and Development Board. Welcome to the first statewide webinar for the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority's Clean Energy Communities Leadership Round. Thank you for your interest in this topic. The fact that so many of us are here today on this call is testimony to the fact that across the state, local governments are striving to create sustainable environments by investing in future-focused clean energy solutions. NYSERDA's Clean Energy Communities Leadership Round provides the resources and funding to help you successfully execute on those goals. The Leadership Round provides opportunities for communities to access grant funding and earn recognition. With helpful community coordinator support for implementing high-impact clean energy actions, you have a clear path to building community-wide resiliency and economic opportunity. We're excited to begin with a webinar about the New York Energy Stretch Code 2020. It's a high-impact action under the Leadership Round program. I have a few housekeeping things. We'll send today's slides to everyone who registered, of course. If there are questions and answers we can't get to, we will include those as well. You can use the chat and the Q&A features, but we will not be responding to questions as they come in. We're going to save all of those for the end when the speakers are done. This webinar is being recorded, and I want to say thank you to our tech support, Jess and Susie. If you are having any kind of tech issue, they may be the ones who respond. So let's get started with the next slide. So our first speaker today will be Chris Sgroi. He is program manager at NYSERDA, where he is spearheading outreach to promote local adoption of New York's Stretch Energy Code. Chris specializes in providing training and resources for building design, construction, and enforcement professionals. Mike DeWein will follow Chris, and Mike has more than 4 decades of experience in energy efficiency, building science, and energy code development, and he serves on many technical advisory boards to advance codes development. Josh Stack will round us out. He will bring us the builder's perspective. Josh is a verification, audit, quality assurance consultant on passive and healthy buildings. He is coming to us today from Western New York. Josh teaches locally and internationally on resilient science and sustainable design. We're fortunate to have all 3 speakers here today. Next slide. Thank you, Jess. The biggest changes within the CEC Leadership Round are the addition of new high-impact actions and adjustments in grant structure. In addition to having designation grants, this time the program offers point-based grants as well as action grants. There are 2 high-impact actions with an action grant associated with them, and one of them is New York Stretch, which is one of the reasons we're starting with that. This is the only high-impact action that must be completed by a certain date, which we will surely be going over with you. This New York Stretch website has ample resources, including an adoption guide and a model energy code resolution. And we're going to link to those at the second to last slide. And those will be live links that'll be emailed out to you. Importantly, this is a standalone funding opportunity. You won't have to be a CEC designated community to apply. Of course, we hope you will come in as a CEC, but you do not have to be designated. It'll earn your community 1,200 high-impact action points, which puts you on the road for other grants and CEC designation status if your community chooses to seek it. As you can see from this chart, the funding opportunities are good. And now I'll be turning it over to Chris Sgroi.
Thank you. Just a minor point of clarification. I'm a project manager at NYSERDA, and I'm responsible for managing oversight of this program. to perform outreach on New York Stretch 2020. I've been with NYSERDA for about 10 years, maybe closer to 12 years actually. And I've been on NYSERDA's code. I've been part of NYSERDA's code team for that entire time. We are a very small group, and we have a relatively large portfolio. So to help support the work that we're doing with this effort, we have a great team of circuit riders, and you'll be hearing from two of them today, Mike DeWein and Josh Stack. But we have someone to support every region of the state as communities consider New York Stretch and its adoption. We can provide both technical support and support throughout the adoption process. We've been supporting communities with presentations to town boards, city councils, advocacy organizations, individuals from building departments, et cetera. So we're really here to provide support, whatever support you need as you perform your due diligence on New York Stretch 2020 and determine whether or not it makes sense for your community to adopt. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. So what is New York Stretch Energy Code 2020? Basically, it's a one cycle, what we're considering a one cycle stretch beyond the state's current energy code, which is it's the minimum standard for efficiency with respect to building construction. It applies to both residential and commercial buildings as defined by the energy code. And based on analysis that we performed of new construction building models, the New York Stretch 2020 on average is roughly 10 to 11% more efficient than the state energy code, which is the Energy Conservation Construction Code of New York State 2020 edition. Municipalities are authorized to adopt more restrictive local energy codes by Article 11 of the New York State Energy Law. And basically, the long and short of that law basically stipulates that a community that adopts a more restrictive local energy law must file with the Code Council, the Building Code Council of New York State, within 30 days. If they do that within 30 days, they can enforce that code immediately if or until the Code Council determines that it is not more efficient than the state energy law. So basically, or the state energy code. So basically, as long as the local energy code that you adopt is more restrictive than the state code, you file within 30 days, you are free to enforce immediately. If you file outside of 30 days, you can't enforce until the Code Council issues a determination. So that's an important piece to keep in mind, and Mike will speak more to that later on in the presentation. New York Stretch 2020 has already been presented to, as NYSERDA published it, has already been presented to the New York State Fire Prevention Building Code Council. We presented the code, New York Stretch code, to the Code Council on July 10th, 2020. And so any community that adopts this more restrictive local standard and files it with the Code Council can be assured that the Code Council is already familiar with it. And we've had no questions to date on the veracity of our findings in terms of its level of efficiency and level of savings relative to the state code. New York Stretch 2020 is an overlay document, so it's a set of amendments and additions to the state energy code. Applies over top of the state energy code. Again, it's roughly it's roughly a one cycle stretch. So New York Stretch code today is anticipated to be as efficient as the state's next energy code, which we can expect in early 2023, given past history of adoption cycles. New York Stretch 2020 is based on technologies products, technologies, building practices that are common today. New York Stretch is not science fiction. It doesn't require any use of any exotic technologies or products. You can comply, builders can comply with New York Stretch 2020 using off-the-shelf products and building techniques that are common in construction today. Additionally, it does not levy any new requirements on building departments. The administration of New York Stretch 2020 is exactly the same as the state energy code. There are no changes there. So it doesn't require building departments to kind of change their practices for enforcement. It doesn't require building department staff to receive any new certifications or anything along those lines. Again, the administration of New York Stretch 2020 does not change relative to the state code. And really what changes are like the values within the code ramp up a bit. Next slide, please. So this graphic is really just meant to illustrate kind of the trajectory of energy code in the state. So many of you probably know the state's energy code is based on a national model standard that is promulgated by the International Code Council. We use for our state's code the International Energy Code, construction code. This graphic shows how that national standard has improved in terms of efficiency each cycle. So in New York State today, we use as the basis of our state energy code, the IECC 2018. And the next cycle will be the IECC 2021. Based on analysis that has been performed by third-party stakeholder groups like the Energy Efficiency Codes Coalition referenced here, we anticipate that the IECC 2021 will be roughly 10% more efficient than the IECC 2018. And when New York State adopts the IECC 2021 in its next code cycle, which again will happen in early 2023, the state's code will be roughly 10% more efficient than it is today. So we really look at, given the fact that New York Stretch 2020 is 10 to 11% beyond state code today, we really look at its adoption today as an early adoption of a relative building performance standard that we expect to see as state minimum code in 2023. So it's again, we view it as an early adoption. And I'm going to turn it over to Mike DeWein. He again is a circuit rider helping to support outreach on this effort. Thank you.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Everybody hear me okay? Terrific. Next slide, please. So lots of benefits to adopting the New York Stretch Code on top of as an enhancement to our base New York State Energy Code, which is, by the way, a great tool for addressing our building energy needs and usage. The energy benefits are substantial, although right around 10–11% on over top of our base Energy Code 2020, which was adopted and implemented about a year ago. There's about an appurtenant incremental cost increase of between 1% and 2%, depending on the building type, and paybacks around 10% or less, again, depending on the building type and where it's located in the state. Of course, it's got greater greenhouse gas reductions. The residential code or requirement section of the New York Stretch is is getting pretty close to near net zero. And also the New York Stretch has a little more performance verification requirement to it. So it really helps us assure that the buildings that are being built to this code are actually performing to this code, or that the requirements are fully installed. And of course, the reason it's so comprehensive and such an impact is that, you know, codes have the potential to address the 40% of our energy use that buildings represent. Next slide, please. So, and of course, there's lots of non-energy benefits, economic benefits stemming from energy savings themselves, but also from the allied impacts of the code itself. And I like to zero in on those economic impacts, particularly long-term, you know, reduce operating costs, save money for the residents, for the tenants, for the owners of our building stock. And we know from many, many studies over the last, long as I've been around, and that's perhaps too long, that you know, that money that's spent on energy efficiency in your community stays in your community. It's a known fact. There's also many climate benefits. There's all sorts of economic opportunity in continuing to develop the industries and the economy for high performance building design and construction, and also performance testings. We also know that better energy codes, better building codes in general, increase community attractiveness. It can even have an impact on insurance rate, as communities are rated for their code efficacy and strength that go to insurance companies for determining rates. And energy is all a part of that. The building energy codes, the New York Stretch particularly, are based in current building science, which has shown to us to also improve the durability, resilience, and sustainability of our buildings as they change and as materials in them change, as well as helping with healthier indoor environments, both on the residential and the commercial side, which is a huge concern in this COVID society we have going on right now. And finally, you know, it's important that inhabitants of our buildings, which are shelters to keep the weather out, among other things, those occupants in New York Stretch code buildings will be that much more comfortable and happy with their surroundings, as will office and other building occupants. Next slide, please. What's the difference between the New York Stretch and our base 2020 energy code? Well, there have been some improvements to the building enclosure, the building envelope, in terms of, you know, insulation level, better attention to insulation detail, windows and skylights and such. There are improvements in the building enclosure in the area of air leakage, both for energy use, comfort, and also for building indoor air quality issues too. And dealing with thermal breaks with the air barrier, with the insulation improvements, are particularly improved in the area of commercial buildings. And in some cases, you know, larger commercial buildings will now need to be blower door tested um, where, or I should say, like residential homes, all new homes have to be blower door tested. And this is terrific because it reverses a trend to very poorly detailed and maintained air barriers in commercial buildings from previous codes, where we were told that the building envelope didn't mean as much and air leakage didn't mean as much back in the day. Well, we've learned that that is not true. Now we're working to create more airtight commercial buildings as well, so we can control the environment inside. There's also more efficient lighting power allowances, both indoor and outdoor, and lighting control requirements as multiple options, so that the efficiency can be realized through not only some newer technologies, but also controlling them more wisely, and when those rooms or buildings are occupied or not is a big plus. Next slide. On the commercial side, there are some electrification readiness measures. Now, the New York Stretch Code doesn't require solar photovoltaic or renewables or electric vehicle charging, but it does help deal with some of the soft costs that exist for people in buildings that would like to in the future add solar or add charging stations by making the electrical systems ready for charging spaces and photovoltaics. So that's very key here. Again, not requiring those new systems, but doing simple wiring and space allocation requirements in order that it's far less expensive to add them after the fact when the building is already existing. And then a number of different power conversion and consumption requirements on the commercial side. There are additional efficiency packages with some amendments as required in the New York Stretch. They were required previously or as a base in the existing base energy code, but some changes there to make them a little better. And there's some allowances for commercial kitchen equipment and building commissioning, much of which already exists in the energy code base, but it's being stepped up a little bit to provide much more efficient buildings through just the assurance control that those requirements are being detailed and assembled and installed properly. That full New York Stretch Code is available at this website here, which you'll have in your handout, your presentation handout. Do go there and look at the tremendous set of resources. We'll talk about them a little bit more in a bit here too, but next slide, please. Folks ask about the cost effectiveness of this new stretch energy code. And codes, the cost effectiveness of codes is, and the cost in general of codes and regulation is always called into question. NYSERDA did a tremendous cost benefit analysis, both the commercial and residential side, for new construction using really the most conservative approach, the prescriptive compliance path method, and simple payback, which is kind of a silly way of looking at energy improvements to buildings, because most of those improvements have lifetimes way beyond their simple payback age, if you will. So again, statewide, across 9 building types in all 3 climate zones in New York State, we have an average of about 7+% in energy. The incremental cost a little over $1 square foot, and simple payback a little over 10 years. Next slide. And here across all three of our climate zones, climate zone 4 being a lot of, downstate New York, the counties around the city, New York City and Long Island. 5 being a good part of the upstate area of New York State, and then climate zone 6 being to a large extent the North Country and a few other scattered counties. But you can see the distribution of energy cost savings, lower in those warmer regions, generally up closer to the 10% in the colder climate zones. And of course, commercial being a greater portion of the construction weighing overall, although that's changing in upstate New York too, as many of the urban areas are undergoing some interesting economic advancements and rebuild of our old building stock. That's changing. And again, around 10 years, give or take, for the simple payback and the incremental costs spread from about $1 to almost $2 a square foot. Next slide. And again, just before I forget, that full cost benefit analysis is on the website, which you will see the address for again. It's a great piece of work, and will keep you entertained for hours if you really want to dig into the dollars and cents. Great job by NYSERDA and their consultants there. On the residential side, the differences particularly involve, again, some building envelope changes, some slightly better requirements for windows. Windows, aren't usually much of an issue because the window industry has been very involved in the code changes and are, in most cases, way ahead of the baseline code changes, and many products at the state of the shelf level that the New York stretch code is at, but again, moving the market to adopting them. Here we see more efficient lighting requirements, requirements for duct systems that make sense, that we've been trying to promote at the high performance building level for years, decades. Requirements for proper sizing of duct systems and HVAC systems. Also requirements for solar and electric vehicle ready accommodations for those technologies when the building owner would like to go to them to lower those front costs. The energy rating index gets more efficient, if you will, for most of the base energy code. That requirement is 62. The better the home, the closer to 0 you get. Step down to 50 is a pretty significant step. This is an option available in the base code as well. It's not anything new. It's just you have to go to a more efficient level with the energy rating index. It's conducted by a home energy rater, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Passive house is becoming a sought after feature of new home construction these days, and really kind of worked its way out of the downstate New York City, Long Island area, but much as the lead building and housing program, passive house is becoming an interesting one, and many home buyers are looking for passive house certification of their new home. So that is allowed as a compliance path in the New York stretch as well to take advantage of that market and that market movement. And it uses the ERI method, again, usually administered by a home energy rater, to achieve the energy portion of those better conditions in your high performance home. Next slide.
Mike, I just want to give you the 5-minute mark.
Okay. So costs and savings, you can see here 1,500, a little over 1,500 to a little over 2,100 with simple payback, on average 5 to 10 years. Next slide. And the same single family and multifamily weighted averages across all of our climate zones, which is New York City itself, 4A New York City, 4A balance, which is Long Island and much of the downstate area around the city, 5A and 6A, and then the total of New York State. And again, payback and costs, just give or take around the numbers we've been talking about. Next slide. And as I mentioned, there's tremendous resources available on that New York Stretch website. One of them, or two of them, I should say, is that NYSERDA arranged with and underwrote the enhancement of the very often used ComCheck and ResCheck compliance tools for designers and builders. It's developed by the U.S. Department of Energy, and I had the pleasure of being involved in the very, very early days. Great tools that many code officials in New York State require. So these tools and their use and their adaptation enhancement for New York Stretch will be very much appreciated. Josh Stash is on deck here. Take it over, Josh.
Great, thanks everybody. So I'd like to provide today a builder's perspective and also a perspective of a third-party verifier who works with municipalities, code officials, and projects to verify above code energy and non-energy performance. And so really, these case studies, I think, illustrate in a very significant and concrete way the energy and non-energy benefits of New York Stretch. Next slide, please. So these case studies, for example, illustrate how New York Stretch can enhance indoor environmental and air quality through its provisions, how it can enhance thermal health and comfort, durability, be part of a broader strategy for communities to engage in healthy and resilient building stock and buildings to enhance public and community health. It also shows that New York Stretch is readily achievable utilizing recognizable off-the-shelf technologies, systems, and materials. I can certainly attest to that as a builder, as these case studies do as well. So New York Stretch also utilizes best practices from long established third-party programs such as Energy Star, and also integrates with existing code verification and administration processes, as Mike and Chris had mentioned. So this first case study is Creekview Apartments in Canandaigua, New York. And the city of Canandaigua is actually considering New York Stretch, as are dozens of other communities now as part of this program. And the exciting thing with this case study is that it's been constructed, certified under the Passive House, the FIAS Plus standard, which is one of the New York Stretch compliance pathways. It's an all-electric building, net zero energy, focuses on healthy ventilation utilizing energy recovery ventilators, and then also utilizes passive building principles, which are based, as Mike said, on best practice building science and really building physics. So there's a very nice scientific base to much of these systems, technologies, and strategies that New York Stretch integrates into the above code program. Really, one of the more exciting things about this case study is that phase one is completed and certified and would qualify under New York Stretch. And phase 2 is actually in development and construction now, which really attests to the success of these type of strategies, that phase 1 was completed and phase 2 is underway today. Next slide, please. So the second case study I'd like to talk about is Zero Place in New Paltz, New York. You can see the project team there and some of the technologies that were integrated into the project, including ground source heat pumps for space conditioning with integrated domestic hot water that would serve the entire building. Really shows a best practice where you can integrate ground source heat pumps with domestic hot water to achieve some really significant energy benefits and carbon reduction strategies. Also focuses again on energy recovery ventilators for whole building healthy ventilation, which is again a best practice to include a dedicated ventilation system that's decoupled from the thermal performance, for example. Also includes solar PV, a high performance thermal enclosure with insulated concrete form walls and above code insulation slabs. And with that, I think what I'd like to do is pass it back to Mike to close us out.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to have you on the team with your background as a builder. Next slide, please. On that, especially on the passive house and the lead side, it's really good that NYStretch is bringing in these high performance building programs where, outside of New York City, New York hasn't, gotten hip to and taken advantage of the market advantage of a lot of these programs. So good stuff. And I'm glad you got our back, Josh. The way that our work with you and your communities generally goes down can be described best by the process that the city of Beacon used and we worked with to adopt. They were our first adopter in New York State, outside of New York City, of course, who kind of has their own version, although based on NYStretch and almost identical. But the Clean Energy Community Coordinator down in that region, Hudson Valley HVRC, worked with them to get them on board with the CEC program, and then basically handed off to us when they expressed interest in adopting the NYStretch, given that it is such a high scoring activity from the standpoint of the CEC. Plus, it's just really the best comprehensive way to address your building energy use in any jurisdiction or community. We testified, we provided technical support, we testified at a hearing, and in fairly short order, their city council adopted the NYStretch. We did provide some backup through that process, and afterwards, and also, expect to do some intermediate training until the full fledged NYStretch code training comes out sometime in the next 30 days, we hope. Next slide. Now, there's an awful lot going on, and I don't think these stars represent what's happening here currently, but you can see who has adopted. We know that there's a couple of more, but we can't tell you yet, or we'll all have to be killed. There's a couple more very close to adopting right as we speak. And these others that you see, town of Ithaca, the city of Ithaca, as part of their green building code, and the SUNY Construction Fund. Plus, we're trying to verify the use of NYStretch by other agencies, because they're all interested in gaining access to those 140 grants available statewide just for the standalone adoption of the NYStretch code. And then, of course, the fact that the NYStretch adoption gives you the second highest ranking and points towards additional incentives that can add up to several $100,000, communities are jumping all over it. So if you are working particularly in the CEC program, you know, it's good to get online quick. Next slide. As far as we often get questions about, well, geez, you know, is this going to drive the cost of our renovation work up? And in fact, you know, not really so. And it works the same as the base energy code that communities are currently enforcing, or charged to enforce anyway. And for NYSERDA, those apply in the same way. There are some slightly different commercial building commissioning and air barrier requirements, but they just build on what always is already in the existing code, and taking advantage of during renovation and additions, utilizing those requirements that are more recently added to the baseline codes. There's no new existing building requirements for the residential section of the NYSERDA. And essentially, you know, the existing building requirements only impact the work where you're doing new work to a system. Lots of examples of that. I don't want to take time to talk about that right now, but I am wide open to talking to anybody about how this impacts the renovation work that we do under the NYSERDA, or how it might. So feel free to holler. It is a
Mike, you'll see we have a ton of questions about that and related. Yeah.
Yeah, well, again, that might be best handled offline, or maybe we set something else up, but nevertheless, let's move on to the next slide.
Yep.
Now, you have to be careful if you're thinking about local amendments to the NYSERDA. You can amend it. However, you can't, essentially, you can't make it any weaker or any less efficient than the NYSERDA as it's written. This has come up with a couple of communities that have adopted, and they've had to rethink what they were doing. For one community, they were thinking about just adopting the residential requirements. Well, that's fine, and you can do that as long as you don't weaken that, but you need to adopt the entire NYSERDA code for it to be qualifying for high impact action points, and the 1,200 points you get with it. And you'd have to do your own, you know, economic analysis if you needed to prove it out as well, because there just aren't the resources to do that at the moment. You do have to file with the Department of State that you've adopted the NYSERDA code. If you do make changes that might change any other of the New York codes or the NYSERDA itself, they might call that into question when it is filed. And of course, in order to take advantage of the NYSERDA resources that are available, including us, you know, the circuit riders, you know, you kind of lose out because those elements that you change would not be supported by the various resources. Next slide. We also get questions about, you know, the whole third party inspection and verification. Once again, this is not anything new particularly, nor is it anything to be too concerned about. There are a couple of minor improvements in regard to third-party inspection and verification. There is some requirements for commercial air barrier testing and commissioning for new construction, which is a huge improvement. And service hot water commissioning in alterations and additions. Mechanical ventilation performance, again, a good deal when we're talking about COVID. And of course, because Passive House is an option, those qualified or certified in Passive House compliance quality assurance need to be engaged. As to who is responsible for those third parties, well, just like some of the current third parties, which include the folks that need to blower door test every new home or do duct leakage testing. Those are engaged by the builder or the developer or the homeowner, building owner, whatever. The cost for doing so does not have to be passed through by the municipality unless they decide to and would like to. You're not required to hire or train any department staff to perform this work, although that training is available, and it's all part of the growing workforce development incentives that are available in New York. As for third-party qualifications, most of the work that we're seeing here are covered by organizational certifications that have been around for quite some time. The most popular and currently used one are ResNet, HERS ResNet certified home energy raters. And they are the ones that can produce the ERI compliance alternative, which is, again, currently in place in the existing building energy code. So nothing new, but we probably should create more of a reference in the resource site for you to find commissioning agents and a few other of those third parties, but we can help you with that regardless. Next slide, the resources slide. Once again, that link down below, NYSERDA.newyork.gov, Stretch Energy 2020, a lot of good information there that it continues to improve and be built on. And one more, again, reminder that those, if you significantly change the New York stretch when you adopt it, those resources may not cover all of that because, again, there's simply not enough resource to go around for multiple changes. This is precisely the reason why NYSERDA invested in the development of a common New York stretch code, so that in response to the opening in Article 11 of the Energy Law, communities could adopt, one stretch code and take advantage of those resources. Next slide. So to get started, you get a hold of your clean energy community project coordinator in your area. The link to those folks are here. I'm sure that a whole bunch of them are here. And it's good to see you all, even though I can't see you all. Again, look at the New York Stretch website. Also look to the Leadership Round guidance document to continue to understand the potential benefits of a clean energy community program in your and for your community. There's high impact action toolkits, there's an adoption guide, and again, sample model energy code resolution materials all on that New York Stretch site too. Next slide. Am I still rolling here, or should I?
Yes, you are. I do want to encourage you though to let me start asking you questions because we've got some great ones.
Okay.
All right.
Well, so here are the folks you want to get a hold of.
Right.
And I can attest to all those folks across the bottom and the middle slides. They're all great friends and colleagues and good folks and excellent energy professionals. Take advantage of us, please. Don't hesitate to call.
All right. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Thank you, Mike. So we have had about 20 questions, and we are slated, to finish at 1:30, but I surveyed the panelists. They will stick around for about 15 minutes, and we'll try to get through as many as possible. We are going to follow up with a document that addresses all the questions. They fall into several broad categories, but I want to ask our gentlemen speakers, the most often asked question is to delineate, how this affects new construction versus existing, but I've heard you address it, multiple times. So my suggestion would be that we will emphasize that in our document that we send around, the differences between the two. Many questions about that, but we also have a lot of really interesting specific questions. So, gentlemen, are you okay with my going to the specifics, or do you want to talk about the broad question of existing versus new construction?
I can address in a broad stroke the existing building issue, which is one that comes up for most of our statewide code officials all the time, because it's a little wiggly in terms of how you address specific projects. It oftentimes has to be undertaken project specifically, but generally speaking, there are new construction requirements and several different compliance paths for achieving compliance with them. For existing buildings, generally speaking, you have requirements for additions to existing buildings, where that addition can comply all by itself. You don't have to worry about doing anything to the existing building. Just that addition has to comply, or you can show compliance by energy usage of both buildings together, generally. So sometimes if you have a really old building that really isn't very good on the energy efficiency scale, you want this to comply separately, or sometimes they're pretty close, so you bring them together and trade-offs help both. In terms of changes to existing buildings, you really only have to do, generally, work to those systems that you're changing. Okay, new construction on systems you're changing. So you're replacing a roof and the insulation under it. You don't have to bring the windows and the doors and the walls or the whole rest of the building up. It's just those things you're changing, and also in some cases some repair. In terms of specific questions, I highly recommend that we either, we field them, with circuit riders as we can, or we set up another session if we've got 30 people interested in additions and alterations to existing buildings. We get in another Zoom session and talk about it.
Yeah, I would just add also, fully agree with Mike in that really good summary. That the New York State Department of State just issued a technical bulletin, a document that summarizes when the 2020 New York State Energy Conservation Construction Code applies to existing buildings. And that's really the first starting point as to when NYStretch would or wouldn't apply as well, given that it's an overlay of that code. And so we can make that document available with the resources at the end of the call for everyone also. It would be helpful.
Great idea.
Okay, now I'm going to go into some of the specific questions. So here's one that came in more recently. Does the NYStretch code include any consideration of the materials used in construction? How might NYSERDA encourage low energy or net zero projects to limit use of concrete and petroleum-based products, and instead incentivize materials with low embodied energy, especially those that sequester carbon? That sounds like a Chris question, but it's for anybody.
Yeah, so I can answer that. I can answer that quickly. In general, the energy code, whether it's a more restrictive energy code like NYStretch 2020 or the state's baseline energy code, the codes don't prescribe or limit material choices for design. NYSERDA and utilities in some cases will incentivize different products or different materials or different standards of construction that limit material choices for incentives. But in general, the codes don't limit design options. And so NYStretch 2020 doesn't, and the state's base code doesn't. I know that's kind of a non-answer. I mean, I will say, in general, from a state perspective, if you're familiar with the CLCPA, the state has very ambitious mid to long-term goals for both greenhouse gas reduction and efficiency measures over time. And so from a state policy perspective, these are places we're looking at. The levers for how we achieve some of these goals may not be seen in code, though. So hopefully that answers your question.
So I can answer maybe from a different but related perspective. NYStretch, because it's based on third-party best practices such as the Energy Star program, which really forms the foundation of most third-party sustainable construction programs, from the Passive House to the FIAS Plus standard, to Lead for Homes, to the National Green Building Standard. Any of those essentially require Energy Star, and a lot of the, particularly the residential provisions of NYStretch, are based on these third-party best practices. So a community that adopts NYStretch makes it much easier for builders and developers and owners of buildings to design projects that can access those other incentive programs, which NYSERDA offers financial support through different program opportunities, including its new construction housing program. So really what NYStretch could do there in terms of low carbon materials, which is the question, it is lift that baseline for the entire community, which makes it easier to comply and receive financial incentives under these other programs that do include carbon metrics for both operational energy and also embodied carbon, and also waste management and materials management, which have a really key carbon component to it. So it's really a nice entrance point to a broader strategy for communities to build sustainable, healthy, resilient, durable housing.
Josh, another question that you might want to tackle is this one. When you were speaking, or just after, it was asked, it would be helpful to know the total cost per square foot and the amount of the cost that was paid through subsidies for the case studies that were mentioned.
Absolutely. So the Creekview project was a phase 2 NYSERDA Buildings of Excellence competition winner. And as part of that competition, all of the projects were required to submit very detailed data in terms of cost, performance, and tracking. So those metrics and those numbers are available. Same for any of the Passive House projects in New York, which are starting to rapidly intensify in number. So that data is available, and I'd be happy to compile some of those sources, particularly for those case studies, but also more generally, all of the other buildings that also would qualify under NYStretch that have been constructed. There's a really good contained in diverse databases currently, not aggregated into a common database for NYStretch purposes, but certainly that data is available. And certainly the pandemic is somewhat upended the market in terms of material cost and supply, but there NYStretch also offers significant non-energy benefits in terms of health and enhanced ventilation for SARS-CoV pandemic airborne infectious control as part of a broader health strategy for buildings. So the benefits are there, and sometimes the challenge is actually accurately capturing the benefits, because they are so diverse and far-ranging for the projects that do take advantage of these programs to design to them. But we can include some of that information in the materials at the end also.
Okay. Next question that's very good is in residential construction, an unconditioned basement would no longer be allowed to have ductwork run through it. Has the payback and energy savings calculations taken into consideration the energy impact of conditioning the basement? I actually got 2 questions on that.
So I'll field this one. And to be honest, off the top of my head, I don't know the answer to that question. I will say that the cost effectiveness analysis that we have published on our website for residential new construction does clearly, it gives all the details in terms of the methodology that went into modeling the costs and savings, as well as the inputs that we used. And for this specific question, I don't know the answer to that. I do know that the full analysis and the report on that analysis is available on our website. And following this call, I will look into it and we'll provide a response. This also answers another question that I saw here. For any questions, will we reply with answers to the entire group? And so, yeah, we'll prepare a document and send it to everybody that registered for this course. It'll include the question asked and a response. So I'll provide a more detailed response to this question on unconditioned basements there. But the other point that I'll add, kind of relative to this, relative to ductwork, there was a question, and I'm paraphrasing, but basically, if a resident, so if a new build wasn't planning on a heating and cooling distribution system using ductwork, would it disqualify the building from meeting New York Stretch standards? This kind of dovetails with something that I said earlier. New York Stretch doesn't, you can use whatever heating cooling or cooling system you want for your building. New York Stretch doesn't prescribe any requirements for equipment choices. So you can use a non-ducted distribution system and still comply. And if you're to do that, obviously, if you don't have ducts, there's nothing to be concerned about with respect to providing ductwork in conditioned space. But the bottom line is, the code, New York Stretch doesn't tell designers what they must and must not use in terms of material or equipment choices.
Yeah, and I will add to that, Chris, that's correct, but I will add as well that, and having done dozens of cost benefit analyses of energy codes, that when modeling a building to accommodate the overall energy impacts of conditioned basement, uninsulated ducts versus unconditioned basement, insulated ducts, all of the impacts that are calculated in that modeling work are taken into account when you move to different ways of handling whatever compartment of a building that's being modeled. So generally speaking, those impacts are modeled and are taken into consideration.
Yeah, and I would add, just from a building science or best practice perspective, that as a builder, you would always want your ducts inside of conditioned space, and obviously that's a mandatory measure under New York Stretch. The 2020 Energy Code actually requires duct testing is mandatory unless those ducts are located within the thermal envelope, especially essentially within conditioned space, and that is a difficult test to achieve. For a builder, duct tightness testing is typically where we see the most failures in single family and multifamily residential buildings. So any builder would be well advised to bring his or her ducts into conditioned space for a variety of purposes, everything from energy to health to durability to moisture, because as our thermal envelopes become more tight, and any sort of failure in that system or weak link in the system amplifies a broader failure in the home itself. Really, it's to a builder's interest under the current code, even before New York Stretch, to fully bring all ducts within conditioned space. And I think a cost analysis there would be where you establish that primary thermal control and air control layer as required by the code if it would be in the flooring assembly. And so the basement would be outside of that thermal envelope, or if you bring those primary thermal and air control layers to the basement walls and foundation, the slab. And there, the cost trade-off, I think, when you look at the various factors, would, including the risk of failing a duct test under current code, would really tend most builders who thought about it pragmatically to bring those ducts within conditioned space somehow.
Okay, next question. How about modulars that are built somewhere else and then have to meet the HERS rating of our town, being that there's different perspectives with the state code and we are more restrictive with our rating? How about modulars?
Well, so modulars are handled a little differently. They essentially are inspected for the majority of their construction at a factory, or they are sampled to comply by third parties that then those factories submit to Department of State for approval. If you were wanting to build modulars to the New York stretch, you would have to have a third party that that reviews those plans, conducts those inspections, and has a sampling program set up to cover those buildings. As with all modular homes built in New York State, there are some things that you can only see at the point of construction of those or assembly of those modulars. And most of those things are covered by the New York State building codes and for energy, the New York State Energy Code. For example, you got to do a blower door test, and you can't do that when the pieces are all in pieces in the factory. So that needs to be done on site, plus any site built components of that, a full basement, whether it's insulated, not insulated, if it's slab on grade, if it's on a crawl space, all of those requirements would have to be inspected on site, which could be done on site by the local code officials. But getting the state certification for New York stretch at the factory, I don't know if anybody, Chris, is anybody taking a look at that at all?
I'm sorry, Mike, say that again.
So, if modulars were to comply or want to comply, or modular manufacturer, or if a customer wanted a New York stretch compliant modular, they would have to assure that New York stretch modular was quality controlled, inspected in the factory, so that it came out of the factory with all of the accoutrements necessary to comply with the New York stretch code. And then whatever can be and is inspected on site would have to be done on site. But a modular is inspected for the New York State code in the factory, or a sampling of the modular is inspected by a third party. Have you had any conversations with Department of State about how modular housing might be enabled to comply because of that?
I haven't had any conversations with the Department of State. I mean, the bottom line is if a homeowner wants a modular home, whoever is building that home has to comply with whatever code is in place in the jurisdiction where that home is being built. And if it's, so that home should be spec'd to, if it's a New York stretch 2020 community, then that home needs to be spec'd and built to that standard. And as you mentioned, a third party review could help support that process, but it's ultimately up to the builder and building owner and the who's ever constructing that home modularly or not, to ensure that it's built to that appropriate standard.
Yeah,
definitely will need some education there, because often the person that sells the modular is not the person who sets the modular. And, there's a bit of a break between them and the community.
Yeah, we've dealt with that on past projects within the existing code framework. really, it's a really easy solution. It just requires a bit of coordination between the energy rater or the FIAS plus verifier or rater. But generally, the modular companies or the panelization companies that would offer a product that complies with New York Stretch or even the 2020 energy code are going to see this as a business opportunity. And that's really nice about how New York Stretch offers flexibility in administration, that it is up to the permit applicant to solve that problem. And generally that third party network of HERS raters and FIAS plus raters and PHI verifiers exists. And so that's just a project team issue to talk about who's going to look at what, where, when, and how to comply with code. And generally it's a pretty easy solution to work through in practice.
More question, but before we do, I just want to explain something. I explained earlier that Susie and Jess are providing important tech support, but the other name that we're seeing on the screen today is Kevin Stack, who is a very eminent and experienced builder. He is with Buildings in Nature's Image. Yes, he is related to Josh. And for various reasons of logistics, he was not a presenter today, but we did supply his contact information. And so we encourage you to look him up as well. He is FIAS, he is lead faculty. He's a really special and experienced person that we have with us today as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Welcome, Kevin, and thank you for being with us. Now, maybe to take us out, so this is a different sort of question. We talked about how there was a deadline on this high impact action. And so one of the first questions that came in was talk about the legislative action that needs to be taken. And I know that you gentlemen you're not legislative experts, but you all are aware of this piece. And if you could just discuss it.
Yeah, so, it's a good question in that different communities often adopt laws and regulations different ways. Some of them have to adopt them as amendments to overall town code or city code. Some of them can adopt it in pieces. So the actual adoption varies based on the needs of the community and the setup in the community. There is on that resource site, there is a model adoption framework that local communities can give to their council and adopt and adapt to whatever their needs are there for adoption. So it varies. And even how the proposed change or law or statute is brought to the community itself is different. So we're there to help provide support as that happens, where that happens. Again, it's a little bit of a case by case, but that local statute is a great starting point that's on the NYSERDA site.
So,
yeah. Oh, I'm sorry, Chris, go ahead.
I was just going to say, if a community is going to consider adopting New York Stretch, we can't provide legal advice. So we do encourage you to work with your town, village, or city attorney to make sure that what you're adopting is legal and enforceable. That being said, I think the question that I saw was basically, in so many words, does this require a local law, or can a municipality's building department just start enforcing the more restrictive standard kind of like on its own outside of that, that local law adoption? And again, I can't provide legal advice, but what I can say is that for a community to enforce anything other than the state's energy code, it must adopt per energy law section 11-109. It must adopt that more restrictive local standard and then file it with the building code council. Again, if they file within 30 days, they can begin enforcing immediately. If they file outside of 30 days. They can't begin enforcing until the building code department determines that the code, that more restrictive local energy code that the municipality adopted is in fact more restrictive than the state's energy code. So that's the energy law, section 11-109 is what we're pointing to, that communities must adhere to. But again, consult with your local attorneys.
15-minute time overrun. So I want to thank everyone who came. I want to also give a special shout out to the CEC coordinators, the community energy, the clean energy community coordinators who brought so many people to this call today. I also want to thank Dazzle Ekblad of the New York State DEC, who did a special e-blast for us. And I think that's perhaps how many of you came to be here with us. So thank you all for attending today. We'll be sending out the slides. There was a recording made. And thank you all again. We'll be providing more in this series of webinars on the high impact action as the years go by. Thank you.
And I can't encourage you enough, please get a hold of us with any questions. Just pick up the phone and call, email, whatever. Just please do. We're here for you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Take care.